Gertie the Dinosaur is one of the masterworks of cinema. It introduced character animation and smooth flowing cartoon motion into the mainstream. Inspiring Walt Disney, Chuck Jones, and countless other animators to create their own works, this film has become a benchmark in the history of animation. But what about the film's forgotten sister? What about Gertie on Tour? The impact of Gertie the Dinosaur cannot be underestimated. Gertie the Dinosaur was truly the first blockbuster of animation within the silent film era. Winsor McCay was a commercial artist and cartoonist in the early part of the 1900s. He created Gertie the Dinosaur as part of his vaudeville act. Prior to Gertie the Dinosaur, animated films were seen as a novelty and as a secondary entertainment in the cinema. Early animated films were more like camera tricks, trying to show the audience that a drawing or a live-action object could mysteriously move magically on a screen. No attempt was made to make the animation look realistic or have the character develop on screen so that the audience could care about it. McCay broke the animation mold in his first few films. He experimented with movement and creating a smooth, flowing motion of one action into another. He also practiced in his early films doing a little bit of character animation, helping you to see a bit of life inside of the cartoons. All of this culminated in Gertie the Dinosaur. It was a fantastic film, showing character animation and thought processes going on inside of the character, leading the actions of the character throughout the film. Gertie the Dinosaur was a masterpiece, and it was an immediate hit. The impact of Gertie the Dinosaur is much greater than mere financial success. Audiences were overwhelmed watching the film. Some believe that Winsor McCay actually had performed some sort of visual trick in order to make them believe that they were seeing something other than an animation. It was the first animated film to receive true critical recognition from the mainstream press. Drama critic Ashton Stevens loved the film and praised it. The New York Evening Journal called it the greatest act in the history of motion picture cartoonists. The animation industry was immediately transformed. No longer were audiences happy watching a trick film or watching a film that appeared to be a drawing come to life. They wanted to see characters on the screen. The Sullivan Studio would later, in the 1920s, become very famous for their films starring Felix the Cat. Films which showed animation that was very much drawn upon Gertie the Dinosaur. Walt Disney was among many young people who decided to become animators based upon seeing this film. Warner Brothers cartoon director Chuck Jones would later say, "It is as though the first creature to emerge from the primeval slime was Albert Einstein, and the second was an amoeba, because after McCay's animation, it took his followers nearly 20 years to find out how he did it." Audiences of the 19-teens eagerly anticipated a sequel. However, a sequel did not come right away. Making a profit off of Gertie was not the first concern for McCay. He saw his animation as an art form. On May 17, 1915, a German submarine struck the British liner Lusitania. 128 Americans were on board, and 1,198 were dead. This was an event that outraged McCay, and he decided to take action. Additional subjects of interest for McCay also started to show themselves in the late teens. The Centaurs gives a good idea of where McCay's interests were lying at this time. Winsor McCay was moving away from character-based animation and moving more towards graceful movement and exploring some of the fantastic ideas that you saw inside of his comic strips. In fact, Gertie herself came out of one of McCay's comic strips. McCay's interest in the surreal led him to have interest in other types of cartoons. Moving into the process of cell overlay animation, McCay started to focus on cartoons that had more extensive backgrounds. He also focused on extensive movement and surreal action. In all, McCay completed 10 films between 1911 and 1921. As an artist, McCay was proud of his accomplishments. He would share his work with others that were interested in animation, and this eventually caught up with him. In fact, it actually hurt McCay. He pioneered an animation technique called in-betweening. The animator would draw the major poses first, and then draw in-between actions to fill out the motion. McCay proudly showed a rival animator, JR Bray, this technique. Unfortunately, Bray took advantage of McCay's generosity and also took advantage of the situation. Bray took out a patent on the technique and then sued McCay. McCay was ultimately able to prove in court that he used the technique before JR Bray. However, the damage had already been done. McCay saw his rival become rich off of his technique and lost interest in the animation industry as a whole. Although McCay never spoke about the Bray incident publicly, it must have been devastating. The timing of the event also means that it is likely that it had an emotional impact on McCay in regard to Gertie the Dinosaur. Documents suggest that McCay may have been able to countersue and receive some royalties back from Bray. However, McCay would always be suspicious of the animation industry and work on the fringes of that industry. In 1927, at a dinner in his honor, McCay said the following: "Animation is an art. That is how I conceived it. But as I see what you fellas have done with it, it is making it into a trade. Not an art form, but a trade. Bad luck." He would make films that would stimulate his senses and his heart. No one knows for sure when work on Gertie on Tour began or why a full film does not exist. As of early 2021, the only existing print of the film is less than 2 minutes long and in fragmented form. Comparing the print to other existing films, it has been estimated that the film was created between 1918 and 1921. Due to similarities in style with the film Dreams of a Rarebit Fiend, most film historians, including John Canemaker, author of Winsor McCay, His Life in Art, believe the latter date of 1921 to be the most accurate. According to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., it is possible fragments of Gertie on Tour may have actually been shown as part of McCay's Dreams of a Rarebit Fiend film series on a limited release. Unfortunately, to date there has been no contemporary report found to confirm public showings of the existing fragment. Held as part of the AFI Canadian collection, is awkwardly positioned on the same reel as a copy of the Centaurs. The Gertie on Tour film fragment is truly a mystery. In a sense, it is miraculous that Gertie on Tour exists at all. Very little of McCay's original artwork has been preserved, with much of his work being destroyed during a 1930s house fire. In addition, McCay sold off many pieces of his work over the years to raise funds. Very few pieces have been recovered, although there may be a number of existing preliminary sketches or full artwork in private hands that have yet to reach the public eye. McCay himself destroyed many of his original film elements in order to make space during his lifetime, and other elements have deteriorated to an unstable state due to a lack of preservation. Canemaker reports that young animators discovered most of the current existing prints of McCay's films in 1947 and self-preserved the films for posterity. Gertie on Tour, in its entirety, will be shown now. Without an existing script, storyboard, or specific notes on the production, it is impossible to know exactly what McCay's intentions for Gertie on Tour were. The vast majority of the information that we have regarding Gertie on Tour comes from the film fragments themselves. However, in addition to the film fragments for this film, there are a few isolated frames of film that have been found in preserved archives of McCay's work. A small number of sketches and notes also exist. The isolated frames and sketches have been released to the public through John Canemaker's book and are protected by copyright. An isolated production still and McCay's sketches have been redrawn here to provide you with a visual understanding of the information provided in these rare documents. None of the following drawings are the original works from McCay. In this isolated film frame, we encounter Gertie as she walks among a supersized forest of mushrooms and plants. It is not known how this particular scene would play out among the film's ongoing plot. Considering that one of the existing scenes includes a dream sequence, it is reasonable to think that this scene may have been part of Gertie's dreams in the film. A less likely projection would be that Gertie's journey outside of the prehistoric landscape could have taken her into the realm of fantasy. Regardless, the lost portions of the film would have taken Gertie on quite an adventure. As you will see, most of the film's missing scenes are to take place within the modern world, making this particular isolated frame fascinating in its unique subject matter. There was to be a Brooklyn Bridge scene showing that Gertie could climb to the top of one of the bridge's large pillars. Gertie would playfully jump into the middle of the bridge, causing it to bounce and propel cars from the roadway. Gertie would ultimately jump into the water from the bridge, causing chaos within the water, in addition to the ongoing disaster started up on the bridge. Continuing the disaster film motif, Gertie would continue her journey in Washington, D.C. Upon seeing the Washington Monument, she would attempt to pick up the monument as if it were a treat to enjoy. Recognizing the crisis that she was causing, Gertie would place the monument back where she found it. Only one sketch is available for a planned Atlantic City scene. It appears that the scene would have shown Gertie walking among beachgoers as she moved towards the boardwalk. It is easy to see why Winsor McCay was drawn to make this Gertie sequel. Inserting a huge dinosaur into the modern world creates all kinds of excitement and potential for adventure. What is less easy to see is why McCay ultimately decided to cease production. Animation historian John Kaymaker believes the production stopped due to McCay himself losing interest in the film. Kaymaker's hypothesis lies within the existing fragments and the clues hidden within. The existing fragment seems to indicate that the charming interaction between the narrator and the disinterested dinosaur from the original would not be carried over. Such a change puts more of an emphasis on the film director's choices, and the remaining film seems to suggest that McCay was lacking in certain areas of film theory. Observe that our protagonist appears to be meandering on screen without a definable purpose in the film's opening scene, standing in stark contrast to the amusingly aloof innocent of the original. While the interaction with the frog is mildly amusing, it pales in comparison to Gertie's earlier interactions with prehistoric beasts. The reliance on repeated animation cycles is readily apparent. In addition, McCay appears to be struggling to stage the action here, allowing Gertie to experience much of her painful reaction in the background of the scene instead of in the foreground. Later, McCay leaves the foreground empty as Gertie plays with the train car with her back turned to the audience. Perhaps McCay's lack of film training and education led him to become frustrated when the scene resulted in less engagement than what was originally planned. The Library of Congress reports that McCay turned over an increasing amount of work on this and other animated shorts of the time period to his son, John McCay, and animation assistant John Fitzsimmons. It is possible that Winsor McCay may have felt less connected to the character and the story of this particular film. The existing dream sequence is also awkwardly laid out, with the crowded circle of frozen dinosaurs around Gertie distracting the eye from her movements, resulting in Gertie only catching her eye when she throws herself into the most exaggerated of motions. Animated films had moved forward since 1914, with more complex scenery and an increased amount of camera movement within films. The days of a single, locked-in background without any changes in viewer perspective were over. It appears likely that Winsor McCay became frustrated when Gertie did not feel as delightful inside of her increasingly complex landscapes. While it is clear that there were additional scenes created for the film, considering the awkward cuts of the existing fragments and the existence of isolated film frames, it appears likely that the elements were destroyed by the fire or by McCay himself. McCay may have also lost interest in the film due to his declining reputation within the film community and with 1920s filmgoers in general. Canemaker's book indicates that others within the film industry found McCay to be increasingly difficult to interact with, finding him to be impossible to collaborate with due to his solitary nature. McCay became increasingly frustrated with the animation industry of the 1920s in general, finding most of the output to be crass and without artistic ambition. At a later dinner thrown in his honor by producer Max Fleischer, McCay became frustrated when his audience appeared disinterested in his insights into animation. One observer of the speech noted that McCay gave technical advice, which his professional audience did not take much stock in. Another attendee, Richard Humer, said McCay rambled on about his split system, his term for keyframe animation, which the studio animators had figured out long before. Combining his lack of professional support with declining returns on his animation investments, it is likely that McCay simply lost interest in bringing Gertie back to the screen. Ultimately, Gertie on Tour was essentially forgotten by its creator and by the public in general. It would not be until the advent of the internet that McCay's lost blockbuster would resurface and become readily available for viewing by the public. YouTube, DVD, Blu-ray, and streaming devices have all made the film accessible to the masses and has finally led eyes to this forgotten film. Ultimately, the questions we are left with come down to this. Did Winsor McCay destroy his own film? And if he did, was it the right choice? In a sense, it may be commendable if McCay did indeed destroy most of the film elements of Gertie on Tour. Such an action would show that McCay was so dedicated to his art and the quality of his output that he would destroy that which he devoted most of his efforts into. It would also show that McCay was not willing to cheapen the public perception of his most noteworthy masterwork. On the other hand, perhaps McCay did not fully recognize the genius of his ideas. If Gertie on Tour had been completed in full, it could have proved to be a pioneer in the adventure film genre. McCay's film would have beat the 1925 classic, The Lost World, to the screen, providing the public with its first taste of sci-fi disaster. It would have also likely influenced later films in this category, such as King Kong. While this sequel likely would not have had the same great impact on the animation industry as its predecessor, there is a great likelihood that general audiences would have enjoyed the eccentric and exciting adventures of Gertie on Tour. While the character animation in the sequel may have been less impressive than the original Gertie the Dinosaur, one could imagine audiences still enjoying the misadventures of McCay's giant innocent. Ultimately, is there anything more that an audience could ask for than being enraptured and entertained?